Oh boy.
When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory.
You're watching Adventures in Music Theory with your host, Dr. Robbins. So today we're going to continue our discussion of seventh chords. Thus far we've talked about the 5-7 chord exclusively, the dominant seventh chord. And today we're going to add to it another chord that shares a family with it. It's the 7 diminished chord with the 7th added. It's a member of the family of what we call dominant functioning 7th chords. A 5-7 chord, which is a dominant 7th, is obviously a dominant functioning 7th chord, which means dominant functioning means it helps us hear the tonic as the tonic. But in a major key, you can also take your leading tone triad and add a 7th to it and have a 7 half diminished 7 chord, which is one of these dominant functioning 7th chords. And in minor keys, because we do things like melodic minor and harmonic minor, in minor keys you can of course have a major minor 5-7 chord, which is the one we have most often. It's possible to have a minor 5-7 chord, although you're really not going to see that hardly ever. But the things we see a fair amount of the time in minor keys are the 7 fully diminished 7th chord when we raise the leading tone, and the 7 half diminished 7 chord when we raise the 6th and 7th scale degrees. So that's one type of 7th chord that deserves its own category, the dominant functioning 7th chords. And then today the other thing we're going to talk about is just all the other 7th chords. A 7th chord, as I've said, can happen on any scale degree. Any chord can be a 7th chord. And that little menu down there in the box on the bottom shows you all the possibilities for non-dominant functioning 7th chords in major and minor keys. And in minor keys there are a lot more than there are in major keys, because in minor keys all the chords can be a couple different qualities, right? You can have a diminished 2 triad or a minor 2 triad. You can have a major 3 triad or an augmented 3 triad. And you can add 7ths to any of those things as well. So there are a lot of different qualities of 7th chords just waiting for us to learn about. And hopefully what we're going to learn today is they're not very difficult once you get the basic handle of how 7th chords work in part writing. And of course that thing is, as I've said at least 1,000,000 times now, when there's a 7th in the chord, resolve it down by a step to a tone in the next chord. So let's go ahead and talk about these other dominant functioning 7th chords. So here's a passage in B flat minor from your textbook. It's got 2 dominant 7th chord, or dominant functioning 7th chords as the second to last chord. The first one's a 5-4-3 chord, which is F, A natural, C, E flat. And the second's a 7 diminished 6-5 chord, which is A natural, C, E flat, G flat. Listen to this passage and notice the effect of both of those chords. And now the second one. The first one. Second one. Five, 4, 3 to 1. 7 diminished 6-5 to 1. The thing you have to admit is that even though they both sound a little bit different, both the 7 diminished 7 chord and the 5/7 chord have about the same effect in helping that B flat minor chord sound like tonic. Those chords are what they call functional equivalents, which means you can get by with substituting one for the other sometimes and get about the same effect. It's like using a synonym. You could say that it's hot outside, or you could say that it's muggy outside. They're both expressing the same thought with a slightly different word. And of course, both of those chords, since they're 7th chords, resolve their 7ths down by step. For the 5/7 to 1, it's the E flat down to the D flat. For the 7 diminished 7 to 1, it's the G flat down to F. But they both have roughly the same effect. They both get the job done. Here they are again. Not a lot of difference. While I've got a minor key here, example here, I want to do one more thing too. Let's do a little ear training. See if you can figure out what I'm changing. I'm playing the top line here. Here it is again. Could you hear how that final chord was a major triad instead of a minor triad? This actually happens a fair amount of the time, especially at the end of phrases in minor key pieces. A lot of times composers like to end on a major triad just to have a more complete uplifting sound. Anyway, it's a thing called a Picardy third, and what it is it's when you take the third of the one chord in a minor key and you raise it a half step to create a major triad. And there's an example of one on the slide for you to look at right now. We're in C minor, so the tonic chord is C, E flat, G. And if you'll notice, in that last C chord, I've changed that E flat to E natural, making it a major chord. And you can look at the chord symbols and see that we adjust our chord symbols accordingly as well, which means that now we have a situation in a minor key where the one chord can become major sometimes. And so whenever you have a Picardy third, you want to make sure you mark your tonic chord as being major instead of minor. As one more example of how these functional equivalents work so nicely, here's a chord progression that substitutes 5/7 chords with 7 diminished 7 chords. Or since this is a major key, it's actually half diminished 7th chords. But it goes 1, 6, 6, 5, 6, 5, and then it goes 1, 6, 6, 7 half diminished 7 to 1. And it sounds like this. It's not a lot of difference between the 5/7 to 1 and the 7 half diminished 7 to 1. Except when I play wrong notes. 5/7 to 1, half diminished 7 to 1. In fact, here's what it would be like if we snuck in a fully diminished 7 to 1. They all work the same. Functional equivalency is a neat thing. And in all these 7th chords, the 7th is going down by a step because that's the name of the game when it comes to part writing 7th chords. Okay, and maybe I've spent a lot of time on dominant functioning 7th chords and you're sitting there worried that he's going to spend forever on the 2/7 chord and the 6/7 chord and stuff, and I'm not. We're going to blaze right through all that. And the reason we're going to blaze right through all that is because we can, because they're just 7th chords and they're fairly easy to deal with. As far as the part writing for them goes, All the stuff we don't do with the other chords, don't double leading tones, avoid parallel fifths and octaves, watch out for overlapping, watch out for bad spacing. All those things are still things we're going to want to be attentive to. And the other thing is, for every seventh chord out there, you want to resolve the seventh of the chord down by step. That's the most important part writing procedure there is, I'm convinced. The other thing is the leading tone. If the leading tone's in the chord you're dealing with, then be attentive to it. If it's in the soprano voice or the bass voice and it sticks out, then it's probably going to be the case that it needs to resolve up a half step in the next chord. If it's in an inner voice, it's not as much of an issue. You can jump away from it if it's in the alto or the tenor. And for pretty much all the part writing in the world, remember that stepwise motion and holding common tones often gets good results. If you hold a common tone, then that's a voice that's not going to be involved in creating parallel fifths or octaves, because those are all based on motion. And voices that hold common tones don't move, so they're not going to be part of the problem. And as we go look at things, notice how often all of these rules, quote rules, get followed, especially the one about resolving sevenths down by step. So, away we go. This little passage demonstrates the idea that the basic procedure for seventh chords is the same no matter what quality they are, no matter where in the scale they occur. If the chord has a seventh in it, let it move down by step into the next chord. And that's what all these little blue arrows are showing, is how all those sevenths in the chords resolve down by step. Here's what it sounds like. And here it is one more time, just so you can like soak that in. It works nice, and all those seventh chords give this progression a richness that it might not have if it was simply triads. So all these things we've been learning about, putting chords in inversion, adding dissonance through seventh chords, really starts adding up to making some more interesting music. Or so I like to think. And that's everything you need to know about seventh chords. So now it's just a matter of getting down and dirty and actually writing some of them to make sure we can apply the stuff we've been talking about. So what I've got here is I've got some of assignment 12.3, and I want us to work through some of it. And you can either pause the video and work out the problem and then play it and see how your solution compares to the one I'm going to give, or we can go through it in real time, your choice. But the first one is, this assignment's all about dominant functioning seventh chords. 5-7, which is a major minor 7, or 7 fully diminished and 7 half diminished 7. So, let's go ahead and write that first measure, which is 5-4-2 to 1-6 in the key of F sharp minor. And we'll talk about why it's 1-6 in a minute. But the first thing we need to do, of course, is figure out what's in a 5 chord in F sharp minor. Well, the fifth note in F sharp is C sharp. So we're talking about building a C sharp, E sharp, G sharp, B chord. And it's important to make sure you put the E sharp in there, because that's what you have to do to get your 5-7 chord to be a major minor 7th chord. So add the E sharp. That's the leading tone in the key of F sharp minor. And then when we go to part write this, let's make resolving the 7th our priority. So figure out what the 7th of that C sharp, E sharp, G sharp, B chord is. It's the B. And the B's down there in the bass. So you want to take that B in the bass and resolve it down by step to an A. And that is why it's a first inversion chord. That A is going to be the third of the F sharp, A, C sharp tonic chord. Remember, 4-2 chords often go to first inversion chords. Now the other thing you may want to look at in this is look at the leading tone. If the leading tone's in the soprano or the bass voice, you need to resolve it up a half step to the tonic. If it's in an inner voice, it's not as required, but I don't see any reason not to resolve our leading tones the right way. So let's resolve that E sharp up a half step to F sharp, the tonic. And let's take that C sharp in the soprano and hold it over because that's a common tone. And then with the tenor voice there on G sharp, moving it by step is a good idea. And there are two notes in the chord that come next that are a step away. There's the A or there's the F sharp. Do I care which one you go to? You have no idea how little I care which one you go to. You can go to either one. You can go up to the F to the A, or you can go down to the F sharp and double the root of the chord. It does not matter. But that's how you do this. And let's move on to the next one now and look at how to handle the 7 fully diminished 4/3 chord. Alright, so I want us to model our 7 fully diminished 4/3 chord on the 5/4/2 chord in the measure before it. And I've gone ahead and set the chord up. And notice I've set it up in such a way that it's as similar to the 5/4/2 chord as it can be. The notes in the 7 diminished 4/3 chord are E sharp, G sharp, B, and D. And whenever there's a chord in common with the 5/7 chord, I've kept it in the same voice. I put the B in the bass voice because that's where it was in the 5 chord. I put the G sharp in the tenor because that's where it was in the 5 chord. I kept the E sharp, which is the leading tone, in the alto. And the only note that's different is the 5/4/2 has a C sharp. The 7 diminished 4/3 has a D. So I put the D up in the soprano. And now it's just a matter of resolving it to a 1 chord. And just like in the last one, let's do the same thing. The first thing we're going to worry about is resolving the 7th of the chord. So in an E sharp, G sharp, B, D chord, the 7th is the D, and that's up in the soprano. So let's resolve it down by step to the C sharp. And then from there, we can do whatever we want. That E sharp in the alto is the leading tone. It doesn't have to resolve up by step, but there's no reason not to, so we could resolve it up to the tonic. And then with the bass voice and the tenor voice, we'll just do whatever seems to work for us. We could take the tenor voice like we did before to either the A or the F sharp. And with the bass voice, if you wanted, you could move it stepwise. It would be weird to move it to a C sharp and make a 6/4 chord, but it would work because it would be a primary triad and the 5th would be doubled. But you could certainly move it down by step to the A and make a first inversion 1 chord, or you could even leap away from that B in the bass down to F sharp and make a root position 1 chord. If you put F sharp in the bass, make sure you put A in the tenor though, because the chord's going to have a 3rd. But that's how we handle the 7 fully diminished 4/3. Now let's go look at the 7 half diminished 4/3. And just like we did before, we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to try to keep as many things in common with the earlier chords as we can. So we're going to keep the B in the bass, we're going to keep the G sharp in the tenor, we're going to keep the E sharp, which is the leading tone, in the alto, and the 7 half diminished 4/3 has a D sharp in it instead of a D natural. And that D sharp is the 7th of the chord, so we're going to resolve it down by step to C sharp. And let's keep resolving our leading tones up to tonic, so the E sharp goes to F sharp. And then with the tenor and the bass voice, just like before, you can pretty much take them to wherever you want. And things will work out pretty splendidly. So let's do yet another one. This one's in E flat minor. And there's a 5/7 chord in E flat minor for you. It's B flat, D natural, F, A flat. That D natural is the leading tone. So when we go resolve, we're going to look at our 7th first because it's a 7th chord. The 7th is the A flat and the tenor, and we're going to resolve it down by step to G flat. And then we're going to think about what's the leading tone in E flat minor. It's D natural. And this D natural is sitting up in the soprano voice, so it definitely needs to resolve up to the tonic. And then with our other voices, we just want to do things that won't create trouble. With the alto, the thing that'll create trouble, I'm going ahead and putting the bass on the chord root, by the way. Sorry, I skipped a step. With the alto, the thing that will create trouble is putting it on B flat. You can't have a complete one chord here because the B flat will make parallel fifths with the bass, and also it'll mess up the chord spacing. You'll have too much space from the tenor or the soprano. No matter which B flat you go to, you're going to be too far from one or the other voices. So with the alto, we're going to move it by step. Probably to E flat, although if you went to G flat, that would be okay. But this is what we first learned about root position 5-7 chords. If you resolve the seventh and the leading tone and keep both chords in root position, you can't have a complete chord for both chords. Okay, and let's look at the fully diminished seventh and the half diminished seventh chord. For the seventh fully diminished 7 chord in E flat minor, there's only one note different. 5-7 has a B flat in it, 7 fully diminished 7 has a C flat in it, but they both have D and F and A flat in them. The weird thing is this: if I keep things as close as possible, then when I go to write my 7 diminished, fully diminished chord, the 7th is going to be in the bass. But that should be okay. Just remember, when you resolve the 7th in the bass, it's going to go down by step. And when it goes down by step to B flat, that means my 1 chord is going to be a 1-6-4 chord. Second inversion chord. And remember, those are some of the chords we have to worry about. So we'll make sure we worry in the right way when we get there. But let's do the other thing we know we need to do, which is resolve that leading tone in the soprano up to the tonic. So we've got a B flat and an E flat. This is a second inversion chord, so we have to double the bass note. That needs to happen in the tenor voice, which means that the alto voice is going to be on G flat so that we get a chord that has a third in it, because that's important. And now let's go try. And the half diminished 7 chord is also a 4-2 chord, which means the 7th is in the bass. Now that 7th is a C natural instead of a C flat, but the same thing applies. We need to resolve it down by step to B flat. We got to resolve the leading tone D natural up by step to E flat because it's in the highest voice. It's a 6-4 chord we're resolving to, so we've got to double the bass note, which happens in the tenor voice, which means the alto has to go to G flat. It's sort of the same tracks we just walked in with the fully diminished 7th chord. Really resolving 7 diminished, fully diminished 4-2 and 7 half diminished 4-2 is going to be basically the same proposition. Let's try one more. So this one's in C sharp minor, and we're starting with a first inversion dominant 7th chord, a 5-6-5. So it's G sharp, B sharp, D sharp, F sharp. We have to put the leading tone in the chord, so that's where the B sharp comes in. And when you get a part right, I know you're tired of hearing me say this, but I love to say it. Make sure you resolve the chord's 7th down by step. The 7th of the G sharp, B sharp, D sharp, F sharp chord is the F sharp. It's in the alto. It steps down to E. The leading tone in C sharp minor's B sharp. It's in the bass voice and outer voice. It's exposed. So we need to resolve it up by half step to the tonic, which gives us a root position 1 chord. The next thing I'd do maybe is think about, are there any common tones between the 5 chord and the 1 chord? And there is that G sharp. It's in both chords, so let's keep it in the tenor. And now we just need to find a place for the soprano voice to go. And it's on D sharp. It could go anywhere in the C sharp, E, G sharp chord. I'm going to take it down to C sharp, but you could go to the E, or you could even come down to the G sharp. And all 3 of those notes would work fine. This makes sense because it's stepwise voice leading though. And when we look at the next chord, we see that it's a 7 fully diminished 7 chord in the key of C sharp minor. There's only one note different. It's got an A in it instead of the G sharp that was in the 5-6-5 chord. So we've still got B sharp in the bass. That's the leading tone that goes up to C sharp. The 7th of this chord, since it's B sharp, D sharp, F sharp, A, is that A in the tenor, so it needs to come down by step to G sharp. And then in the alto and the soprano, I just move them both in parallel sixths down by step. And they give us a nice complete one chord there with no voice leading errors. And now we end up with the 7 half diminished 7 chord, where I just need to make sure that I have A sharp in the chord as well as B sharp to get the chord quality to be right. That A sharp is the minor 7th above the chord's root, and that's what makes a half diminished 7th chord, is a diminished triad with a minor 7th. But everything that happened in the measure before is happening in this measure. Leading tone in the outer voice goes up by step, 7th in the tenor voice goes down by step, and the upper voices move stepwise to chord tones and don't create any bad problems. Hope this makes sense. And this is the harmonic analysis that's part of assignment 12.3. And I've gone ahead and put in the pop chord symbols above the staves first and stuff. Pop chord symbols, if you understand how to do them, they're easier to do because you don't have to worry about key and numbering them or anything like that. You just have to be able to figure out what the chord is and write the symbol up there. And of course, make sure you get the right bass note if the chords are in inversion. And the other thing I keep harping on is, remember, even if the pop chord is a minor triad or a minor 7th chord or something, always use capital letters for the chord notes, for the chord roots and the bass notes. The only lowercase letter we're going to use is a lowercase m for minor. But those are your pop chords right there. And now let's go ahead and look at what the Roman numerals would add to it. This one's in G major, right? 1 sharp in the key signature, no D sharps or anything added that would seem to imply E minor. Starts on a G major chord, ends on a G major chord, and the last G major chord is gotten to from a D7 chord, so that makes a 5-7-1 authentic cadence. But there are Roman numerals, and notice, you can look up to the pop chord symbols and make sure they're matching. The first pop chord is a root position chord. The first Roman numeral shows a root position Roman numeral. The D7 chord's in first inversion, so make sure your Roman numeral says first inversion 7th chord, and it does. It's got a 6-5 after it. So that's a good way to check your work, is sort of make sure your chord symbols above the staff agree with your chord symbols below the staff. And finally, we'll drop in the non-chord tones. And there they all are circled. And one of them is a suspension, the one in the third measure of the top system. So since it's a suspension, remember you've got to put some numbers down there to show what that suspension's doing above your bass note, which is G. So that C is a 4th above G, and then that B is a 3rd above G. So we write 4-3 to show that it's a suspension, not to be confused with 4-3 when the numbers are stacked on top of one another, showing us a 2nd inversion 7th chord. The other thing too is, notice in the A minor 7 chord on the bottom there, that's an A C E chord with a G, that's the 7th. That C sharp does count as a non-chord tone because it's not part of the A minor 7 chord. It's a chromatic passing tone. Other than that, I think these analytical symbols are fairly self-explanatory. So, the homework I want you all to do and take pictures of and send to me is, I want you to do Unit 12, Assignment 4, Part A. Just do the even numbered questions. And I want you to do Assignment 4, Part B. There are 2 different part writings in there. Choose whichever one you want to do. One is figure bass, one is from pop chord symbols. But choose whichever one you want to do. Make sure you resolve your 7ths down by step in your 7th chord. Watch out for those things with spacing and overlapping and parallel fifths and octaves. And let's talk a little bit about the assignment, because the first thing, I give you a bunch of 7th chords and I tell you the key I want you to analyze them in. So give me the Roman numeral and the figure bass for the 7th chord, and then resolve it. And the thing the directions say is resolve it to an appropriate chord. what does an appropriate chord mean? Well, an appropriate chord means a chord that would make sense coming after that. Like when we were writing 5/7 chords, we always went to a 1 chord afterwards because that's the most sensible thing to do. 5/7 tends to lead to 1. Not every chord leads directly to 1. Different chords go different places. So a lot of times the best way to figure out what's an appropriate chord is to think about those circle of fifths progressions we talked about last semester when we talked about functional harmony. Go back and read chapter 7 if you need to. But remember, the circle of fifths is where the chord roots are all related by descending fifths, so you can go around the circle in the scale going 1, 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. So a lot of times what makes the most sense is if you have a 2 chord or a 2/7 chord, the chord that would work well after that would be a 5 chord because 5 comes after 2 in the circle of fifths progression. If you had a 3 chord, then you can look at your circle of fifths progression. In fact, there's one up there in the instructions, and you can say, oh, I'm going to go from a 3 chord to a 6 chord. So let's try one of these. I've done one as an example for you. It's a 6 chord that went to a 2 chord. Let's figure out what question number 1 is there. It's in B minor, and it's a G, B, D, F sharp chord. That's a 6/7 chord. And it's in first inversion, so we're going to call it 6/6/5. So you want to figure out what goes good after a 6 chord. You think about the circle of fifths. 1, 4, 7, 3, 6, 2. 6 goes well to 2. So we want to take our 6 chord in B minor and resolve it to a 2 chord. And 2 chords in minor keys are usually diminished. And remember, a diminished chord is usually in first inversion with a double bass note. So a 2 chord in B minor is C sharp, E, G, and we want to put that E in the bass. And of course we want to put another E in the alto because in the G, B, D, F sharp chord, the F sharp is the 7th of the chord, so we want to resolve that down by step. Your bass note's probably going to go to E, and then you just hold the common tone between the 2 chords, which is G, and move your tenor voice down to C sharp. And that's how you do it. All right, and before I turn you loose to do some homework, let's talk about some things I've noticed from grading the homework thus far on 7th chords, because there's a lot of stuff to keep track of, and it's easy to sort of lose sight of what we want to do. So thing 1 to think about is this. Not just in the 7th chord chapter, but in any chapter from here on out where chords have 7ths. Always be very, very careful that you resolve the 7ths of your chord the right way, which of course is down by step, if they can go down by step to a tone in the next chord. Always be super diligent in resolving 7ths of chords. As far as the leading tone of the scale goes, sometimes be diligent in resolving leading tones. Whenever they're in the soprano or the bass voice, whenever they're exposed in the outer voices, you probably need to resolve them up by step to the tonic of the key. Now here's one that gets people, and I've had a couple people ask me about it, so I'm going to tell everybody this. Remember that the 7th of the chord and the leading tone are not the same thing. And that's a little bit tricky because the leading tone is the 7th note in the scale, and it's a half step below the tonic. But when we talk about resolving the 7th of the chord, we're talking about resolving the note that's a 7th above the root of the chord. So technically any note can be the 7th above the root of a chord. It depends on what the chord root is. Only one note can be the leading tone, and that's the 7th note in the scale that's a half step below the tonic. So don't get those two things confused. 7th of the chord, resolve it down by step. Leading tone of the scale, resolve it up by step, especially if it's in an outer voice. And the final thing is this. When you go to resolve your chords, don't make every single chord a 7th chord. Just because I've taught you all about 7th chords doesn't mean I want you to quit writing triads. There's still a lot of triads to write. So don't make every chord a 7th chord. That's not right, and that's not going to do you well on the homework and stuff. So be careful of those things. It's a fair amount to think about, but you all can do this. You're doing good thus far. So enjoy your homework. Get rest. Take care of yourselves, and I will catch you on the next video. Take care until then.